Hello and welcome to this conversation that we're having on the occasion of International Translation Day, a day that has begun to assume more and more importance as life becomes more and more complicated. Now, translation is something that we do on a daily basis. These are words that we use very frequently when we say things like loosely translated, or when we look at something that is rather unfamiliar or extremely familiar and seek to convert it into semantics, into experiences, into relations that seem quite familiar or can put us at ease or take us home. So considering that, I think that with the mind-boggling levels of transnational migrations, with the ways that languages, experiences, cuisines have melded into each other, translations today have occupied a very, very central concern in our minds, whether we are willing to recognize or realize it or not. And this conversation that we are having today is a marker that goes into the thematics of translations and what it signifies in our world today. And we are meeting here thanks to the efforts of the Samyukta Research Foundation, the parent concern under which comes a very, very significant journal that has, for over 2 decades, committed itself to the area of translations, and it has brought to the forefront rather landmark works from Malayalam literature, in fact, literature from across the country. But in particular, Malayalam literature, bringing to the fore works such as the Oxford Anthology of Malayalam Writing, then plays such as Thoril Rengatheka, which was a play that was performed by a women's collective that was modeled on V.T. Bhattadaripad's play, Adikalainana Arangatheka. And of course, it has carried over its history number of significant independent works, such as translations of Paramudi Paranayam, the translation of Kochereti, works that have then gone on to become landmarks in the history of Malayalam literature and translation in particular. So, I think that the time is absolutely right that we recognize these works and we also try to take the idea of translation forward. And currently, this work continues in terms of translating Margaret Duras's Love into Malayalam. It is translated as Pranayam. So, all power to Samyukta Research Foundation and to Samyukta India Press. And thanks to them, we have with us Miss Mini Krishnan. And there is an official way of introducing a resource person, and I'm going to do just that. But after that, there is something that I would like to start off with about my association with Miss Mini Krishnan. So, for all purposes, for the world outside, Miss Mini Krishnan has edited translations for Oxford University Press. She was the series editor of the Macmillan India translations from 1992 to 2000. And in fact, she has, I suppose, a total of 105 translations to her credit, as editor, and 37 of them for Macmillan and 68 for OUP. She was the founding editor of the South Asia website for women writers, hosted by the British Council, member of the Advisory Committee for National Translation Mission, member Indian Literature Abroad, and consultant editor for the Malayalam University Translations. And currently, she coordinates a translation program for the Tamil Nadu Textbook and Educational Services Corporation to promote English translations of Tamil works. She works through multiple publishers such as Amazon Westland, Neogi Books, Rupa Publishers, Oxford University Press, HarperCollins India, Ratna Books, Penguin Random House, Taylor and Francis, and Vitasta Publications. That's how they send across their books. And she regularly contributes to the Hindu and the Mathrubhumi, and she selects translations for short fiction for the front line. And I have found her to be a critic, a thinker of startling originality, and above all, economy. There is remarkable economy and power in her words, and she speaks from a point of historic awareness and realization, which again aligns itself with the kind of work that is done at the Samyukta Research Foundation. And now, let me introduce Miss Minnie Krishnan the way I know her. In my days, in the early 2009, that part of the time, when I was, scouring for books at one of the second-hand bookstores in Tirunanthapuram, I came across a rather interesting book that was called Ponniyin Selvan. And because I had heard of the writer Kalki, without much thought, I picked the book up and brought it home and read it. It was a gripping translation. Read it from cover to cover, and that's when I realized that the book has a number of different parts, and they were not available at the second-hand books stall. So I told this teacher of mine, Dr. G.S. Jayashree, who incidentally has been working with Miss Vinnie Krishnan over years on these various translations. Particularly some of their books had been brought out by Oxford at that point of time. I said, there is this book called Ponniyin Selvan. It's been translated, but I don't have the rest of the copies, and I really want them. And she said, who edited this series? I said, someone called Minnie Krishnan. She's like, that's a friend of mine, and let me talk to her. And then, less than a week, there's a bookstall outside my college. And the man who runs it came to the Department of English where I teach, and he said there is this package waiting at Macmillan, in the city, for this teacher called Sonya Nair. Could you please ask her to go get it? So I was intrigued. I'm like, why would Macmillan hold a package for me? And when I went there, the outlet at Trivandrum, the Macmillan outlet, they treated me very nicely and handed me this package which contained the rest of Ponniyin Selvan, and I couldn't be happier. So, for this is the original that I picked up from the bookstore. I just wanted you to take a look at it, okay, and it's still there. And then an entire set of books that were sent, and I realized that this person's commitment to the work that she does is tremendous, that she wants it to get across to the people and that it be read for the kind of significance that this book has. And over a period of time, I've lent it to a number of people, and I would like you to know, Minnie ma'am, that they all absolutely loved it. Today, I understand it's going to be a motion picture directed by someone no less than Mani Ratnam. So that's and over the years, of course, we have corresponded briefly. But years later, I came across another book called Jeevichirikkinnavarku Vendiyullo Peace by Johnny Miranda, and I turned it around, and sure enough, who should be the series editor but Minnie Krishnan? And without a second thought, I purchased the entire novella series, which for me is a landmark, I think, work, a collective in terms of translation in India, because it brings to us in capsule form so many cultures, so many languages, so many points of view and systems of living, which I think is very, very relevant. So now this conversation is something that I'm supposed to be having with you. So I'm cutting short this monologue. Going to ask you a very important question, which is, how are you doing?
Well, actually, thank you very much for this opportunity. An editor hidden behind a desk and within a four walls, and now, of course, everyone's hidden away. But usually, an editor very rarely gets a chance to meet readers, and it's always been my ambition to connect with those who are teaching literature, because I honestly believe that that's the only tribe that can take uh, translation and our own literature through English forward, because they have a good grasp of the canon of English literature, and they know intuitively, instinctively, how English can be used to promote our languages, our literature. And I mean, translation is primarily seen as translation of literature. That's what we're talking about. But as you said earlier, translation has played a huge role in the encounter of civilizations, mathematics, astronomy, so much of science, road building, bridge building, all of this has come through translation. And, especially, the knowledge empires that we had, Arabic, um, in Baghdad, in China, so much of it destroyed through relatively modern, recent politics. But it all somehow, dedicated and hardworking scholars. I mean, those days you just think of how difficult travel was, the 13th century, 15th century, 18th century. I'm just bringing out a book through Niyogi for Tamil Nadu government venture. It's Uv Swaminath Iyer's life. He's called the Tata of Tamil because he revived. He collated, edited, found manuscripts in all small villages and all that. This was late 19th century, early 20th century, when travel was still very difficult. And, it's because of him that we have Mani Meghalai and Silavatikaram. Otherwise, we would never have those texts. And just driving up to Kuno, driving with a very fast car, and he was thinking, how difficult Ube must have found it to travel in bullock carts and very slow trains and no hotels, no proper sanitation, all that, living in small chowdhuries. And, if somebody allowed him to sleep on his veranda, he'd sleep there, or trying to get a meal from a scholar's house. So anybody who's worked with languages, with literature, with reviving their heritage, all these old manuscripts, that's 19th and early 20th. You can imagine how difficult it was even earlier. Even very rich scholars traveled slowly and great danger. So if you look at the history of the way people have collected texts and preserved them and then worked on them, no electricity at that time. Everything had to be copied by hand. It's a stupendous thing of civilizational value. And my great worry is, in fact, Satchidanandan's mentioned it in his article for, this is a book I would request you to publicize. Anyone who's interested in translation should buy this book. Because in it, there's a lovely, lots of good articles, particularly Rita Kothari and there's Satchidanand's, and he said his great worry, and I'll read his precise words, I won't paraphrase it. He says about globalization. Give me a minute. Globalization and the cultural amnesia it imposes on countries like India leads to a marginalization of this important activity. We are becoming more and more monolingual, at least in terms of linguistic competence, whereas inter-language translation requires competence in at least 2 Indian languages, including some knowledge of the regional cultures and literary traditions that inform the texts. So this is, while it's great to speed along with the rest of the world economy, linking up with progressive countries, we are in danger of losing something. So what was the question? I've forgotten, but you said, where am I? How am I? How am I? I'm happy about the situation, the reach translation, the idea of translation has today, and most importantly, that academia in India is recognizing it. Academia is so slow to change, very entrenched notions and values, and should we or shouldn't we? They are insecure if there isn't a piece of paper which says something that they can't say in class or something. But your generation, even the 10 years people senior to you, Dr. Jayasree's generation, they were willing to step up and stand up for translation, invest. And Samyukta invested in translation. No government support or no great funding, all collectives. So there you have, I don't know whether to call it a vision or just an ambition, like mine was an ambition, to somehow keep alive our writers, both men and women, of all classes if possible, through translation, at least to make it available. The thing is, promoting translation is very difficult. You have famous, well-known writers in English, any part of the world, and promoting them is different because it's done in a sort of a highly systematic marketing style. They are taken all over the place. They speak. Amitabh Ghosh is seen everywhere. There are interviews, there are excerpts. I mean, he's a household name. Rushdie's a household name. But our writers, or even writers from Korea, say, or Japan. Their best writers are best writers. It's difficult to promote them in translation because they are an unknown quantity and the culture is even more difficult to carry across. So that is the hidden concern of anyone who's working in India on translations, translating into English, because it is through this power language that you're able to drill your way into other cultures and for them to understand you. In fact, the project called Indian Literature Abroad was set up with a very specific purpose, which was to introduce our culture via a translated literature to those countries where we hoped um, to attract the business community, to invest in our country. So there are different plans behind these kind of efforts. I've gone off the point, but you asked how I am, so all these things are always buzzing around in my mind.
Well, now that you have mentioned this, there's something that I wanted to ask you. In the sense, in your mindscape, hmm,
Wait a minute, you have a Pomeranian in your house, right?
no, I don't. It's the neighbors. I don't know
Oh,
what to do
okay.
about
I can recognize the bark of a pom.
Hmm. I have a dog which I have tied in my backyard at this point of time so that they don't enter into a contest.
Okay.
Yeah, what I wanted to ask you is what exactly does translation mean to you?
Oh, well, to me, see, I grew up like an Anglo-Indian. When I say Anglo-Indian, I'm not denigrating any community, but um, I was born 5 or 6 years after, yeah, after independence. And what's happened to the mic? Oh dear. Sonia, are you there?
Yes, yes, I just muted it for a minute.
Oh, okay. And I really grew up very, very far away from my roots. Those days, in the mid 50s, travel was difficult. Uh, we met our natal home and mother's homes, father's home, and their families only once a year. We were sent to convent schools where we were not allowed to speak our languages. My father was a bit of a brown sahib, a journalist who was so keen that we should grasp the language, English language well, that before we went to school, he had a teacher come home, an Anglo-Indian teacher come home and teach us English, get the pronunciation right. That was the goal, of that generation coming out of still in this sort of colonial, for that matter, we still are in many ways. But at that time, I completely lost touch with my roots. My mother insisted on speaking to me only in Malayalam, but I have a twin brother, so we talked to each other only in English. All our friends were non-Malayali, so again it was English. School was fiercely focused on English. There were classes for English readers. There was a whole classes on grammar, then on comprehension, on essay writing. I think 50% of our, and I think in one way it was good. I wish our languages also could be promoted like that today in schools. Science, all that came much, much later. I think when we were in the fifth or sixth standard was my introduction to something called nature study or something like that. But today, children are forced into situations where, when they are all in class three or class four, seven, eight, they have to understand concepts of science, basic concepts, air has weight and all that, before they've actually understood this medium of language, this medium in which they're supposed to understand those concepts. So I think there's something has gone sort of topsy-turvy there. Uh, our education system has taken it for granted that all our children have a great grasp of that medium. That's not the case. The first 3 or 4 years should be just, mathematics, language, poetry, coloring, and, maybe art of some kind. So that the mind is, the vocabulary builds up. Then the children can fly. So when you ask me what translation means to me, there are, of course, all these, you have Anuvad, you have Tarjuma, you have Rupantar, you have so many, but all of them refer to what what I call to myself shape shifting. You know, it's all about transfer, about translocation, about changing, and some of the most dangerous. In fact, one of the most terrible things in history was the bombing of the Hiroshima. I don't know. I know linguists are very familiar with this history, but most people don't know when Churchill and who were the others, um, Roosevelt, or who was the American president at that time. Well, all of them got together and said and demanded. This was July 1945, and asked Japan to surrender. Um, the when the person took the message across to the premier, his name was Suzuki. Um, like most politicians, he was unwilling to respond with a yes or a no, and he used the word mokasatsu, mokasatsu, and the person who conveyed it back to the American general, um, it has two or three meanings. One is perhaps, the other is ignore it or treating it with contempt. And I read this article in The Economist some months ago. I'll scan it and send it to you. And unfortunately, the second meaning was what was probably conveyed to the general, because the general may have told the person who brought the translator would have said, "Look, it has more than one meaning, so I'm not sure what the meaning is." But you can just imagine how the general would have said, "Give me one meaning because I have to take it to my boss," you know. And unfortunately, the thing that was conveyed was, I'm treating this inquiry, this request with contempt, and then we know what followed. So there are these very dangerous things in if it is not conveyed properly, and that is the problem. Most people think that for every word in language A, there is an equivalent in language B, but that's not the case. Even the description of cows or animals or birds, or we have goose and gander, but in some other language you may have just one word for that species. So if you look at that, what translation means is huge effort to narrow the cultural divide with language. The problem is a cultural divide, it's not the language. There may be equivalents, but how to find those equivalents? Unless you've lived so deeply in both uh, linguistic cultures, that is very rare. And the other thing is, and I always say this to anyone who's willing to listen, it's not enough to know those two languages so well. You have to be creative if you're doing translations in literature, and presumably that's what we're talking about. Literary translation is probably one of the most fatiguing things to do, because the other day I was with a very famous poet who said, I asked you to come here at 10, but from a very early morning, I've been struggling to get just one line down. And you're actually an interruption. If a poet can say his own work takes 2 hours to get a line down, when you're trying to convey honestly what somebody else said, it's an even greater burden, because you find your language, your creativity, match it with the creative of another person. It's one thing with your creative rush, you put down something. You don't have to check with anybody else. But here you have to check with somebody else's creativity. You dare not let that person down. It's a double burden. Translation is a double burden. And it also has the advantage of the double force of two languages. That's a phrase which I learned from J. Devika. So what does translation mean to me? It means and you have to be, it calls for high ethics, it calls for patience, it calls for humility. Now, all these qualities, the opposite also uh, comes into play when you're a writer. A writer has to be confident, a writer has to, not unethical, but a writer has to be confident, a writer has to have a certain, let's say, what should I say, almost the arrogance of his or her own creativity. So, you're always balancing between these two lines of thought. You're actually two personalities. You have to play the subservient role, and you have to play the creative dominant role. So when you ask what does translation mean to you, when I watched so many translators struggling and I struggled and sweated with them when you're trying to polish and get closer and closer to the original. It's a lot of work. It's emotional research, and you should keep an open mind. At the same time, you shouldn't be too quelled by other people who say, no, it's not this, it could be that. You're actually quite wrong. It should be. It's definitely not. What you've said is definitely not the right thing. It's very fatiguing, I would say. But if it comes through even 60, 70%, it's a great triumph. And of course, there's the occasional situation where the translation almost outshines the original. There might be situations like that. Poetry, it can happen with poetry because really only a poet can translate poetry. And then, so these are some of the thoughts that come to mind when you ask, what does it mean to you? It also means helping the next generation to recover, to revive, and reinterpret their own histories, because otherwise it could be completely lost. Today, with the emphasis on technology, on science, on business, 10 or 12 years ago, they introduced the BBA. I mean, how can you have a bachelor's degree in business before your mind has matured? You have 17, 18-year-old going and learning about business. Business, like the founders of all huge industrial sort of corporate trading corporations have proved, comes from an understanding of human nature. How do you get the best out of other people? How do you get them to work for you? How do you get their loyalty? Now, the answer to that is not in technology. The answer to that is in understanding the human spirit. The answer to that really lies in the humanities. So these are all links which we seem to be losing. I don't know whether it might just be my old-fashioned reading of the situation.
No, I completely agree with that because